welcome everyone to 1911 Festival of the Empire Project Roundtable, hosted by London College of Communications, University of the Arts, London. So welcome everyone. We're just letting everyone in, and I think there was a large number of people signed up, so it might take a bit of time. So let's hope we can get as many people in as quickly as possible. And just to kind of make you aware that we don't have the chat function on, as you would normally see. What we have got is the audience can post questions in the Q&A tab below, which is towards the right-hand side of the screen, saying Q&A. So if you have questions, please post them as you're going along, and we will read them out when we get a chance, when we pause to take questions and get the panelists to respond to them. So welcome everyone to 1911 Festival of the Empire Project Roundtable, 19th of May 2021. Yeah, as it says on the slides, hosted by the London College of Communications, University of the Arts, London. Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming in. I'm waiting for more participants to come in. So if you can just be a little bit patient with us. So our session today is 1911 Festival of the Empire Project Roundtable, hosted by the London College of Communications, University of the Arts, London. I will do a brief welcome and some housekeeping rules. And what I would like to say to you, and I will repeat, that you're invited to post comments and questions in the Q&A tool, which is on the bottom half of the screen towards your right. The chat function that you might see in previous Zoom sessions that you're part of is not on today, but we're taking Q&A, and as the session goes along and at the appropriate time, we will ask the panelists to respond to those questions. So you're most welcome to post questions as soon as you wish. Okay, we are taking in more attendees at the moment, so just persevere with us and be patient. I will start soon because we have a tight timetable. We have a number of panelists. I'm so excited to welcome the panelists today and to this fantastic session on 1911 Festival of the Empire Project Roundtable, hosted by the London College of Communications, University of the Arts, London. So let's get going. So I want to welcome you. And I'll repeat this again, 1911 Festival of the Empire Project Roundtable, hosted by the London College of Communications, University of the Arts, London. I will be in the background. My name is Rahul Patel. I'm an associate lecturer at the University of the Arts, London, and I'm a co-curator of two zines called Decolonizing the Arts Curriculum and co-leader within the university of something called Decolonizing Narratives, a reading group. So what I would like to do is, again, repeat that we are inviting audience members to post comments and questions using the Q&A tool, which is on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So without any further ado, I would want to welcome Lucy Panasser. Yeah. Okay, Lucy, it's your cue. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rahul. So on the 12th of May, 1911, an elaborate event opened in London's Crystal Palace Park. It was called the Festival of Empire, and its aim was to promote the British Empire to the British public. It was one of many empire marketing events that were held at that time. Yet it is not widely known about, and there is little for today's park goers and those living locally to know it took place. Most published and curated accounts of the park's history focus on the engineering of the Crystal Palace building and its tragic destruction in 1936. Basic details of the 1911 festival are displayed in the on-site Crystal Palace Museum and on Wikipedia, but these are pale in comparison to the dynamic spectacle that the festival was, as you can see from the postcard shown here. I'm Lucy Panesar, and in March this year, I initiated a new knowledge exchange project to make this example of imperialist propaganda more visible and to examine it through a decolonial lens. And I'll unpack this last sentence with some definitions. At UAL, the University of the Arts London, hosting this event tonight, the term knowledge exchange is used to describe the way in which we work with external partners to create positive change. And this is in connection to our UAL strategy. Part of our strategy is to build resilient partnerships at every scale, from local communities to international networks, and to use our creative expertise to empower others. There are many sources I could use to define decolonial, including this from the Museum of British Colonialism. They say that decolonising is about questioning our institutions. How and why are some forms of knowledge given priority and authority over others? How do we organise and categorise knowledge? Who determines the selection and quality criteria of collections? Who decides what is presented and represented, and how do we contribute to a renewal of the canon with stories and reference frames that have been systematically erased from it? For the purpose of this event, I refer to two other sources to define decolonial. Tuck and Yang, who explain how decolonisation brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life, and a contributor to the first UAL and Arts Student Union zine, who says that decolonising is a form of criticality to shake the very ground on which UAL stands. And to succeed in this, UAL needs to have a closer look at its imperial past, its globalised present, and its ambitious future. This knowledge exchange project looks at the 1911 Festival of Empire to develop understanding of Britain's imperial past. What happened and what role did the arts play in this? And what impact has this had on the lives and lands of colonised peoples back then and the lasting legacy of this today? In this initial phase of the project, UAL Knowledge Exchange Impact Funding has enabled me to work in collaboration with LCC student Lydia Wilkes to expand the 1911 Festival of Empire Wikipedia page. She'll speak about that in a moment. With Crystal Palace Museum volunteer David Cardew, who's here in the audience this evening, to start digitally revisualising the 1911 festival from archival materials. And this included a workshop on the 10th of May that was attended by people from across UAL and local community organisations. And I'm hoping that this aspect of the project, the visualisation, will continue in collaboration with UAL students through live projects. The funding has also enabled me to invite external guest speakers to this evening's project roundtable, who I will introduce shortly. First, I want to hand over to Lydia to talk about the Wikipedia editing that we've been doing over the past months.
Hi everyone, I hope everyone's well. I'm a second year photojournalism and documentary photography student studying LCC, and I've been working alongside Lucy and David to expand and edit the 1911 Festival of Empire Wikipedia page. This slide just shows a before and after screenshot of the contents list that was displayed on the page. And prior to our edits, the section clearly lacked a lot of information. And you can see that we've added numerous sections, the first one simply just being a context section. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. We've also, oh, sorry. Yeah, so this is just the context section, which prior to this was literally just a simple one line. We've added a lot more information on this and just expanded the knowledge here. could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. We've also added a section titled the exhibits on the All Red route, and the Red route being an electrical tramway that took visitors on a tour of the scenes replicating the Dominions, as they were called. And we've added another, like a series of archival imagery from the Crystal Palace Museum of these scenes as well, which will be shown later in the slides, which really help just allow you to really, when you're seeing actual images, you can really visualize how it looked, and it just brings it all to life. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. For me personally, adding this section titled Critical Appraisal was a vital element to include in the Wikipedia page edit. Our position in this paragraph is very much so from a decolonial standpoint, and we wanted to open up a critical dialogue to showcase an alternative perspective on the festival, highlighting and really recognizing the multitude of exploitation that occurred at the hands of the British Empire, and also, and additionally, how this event played a role in further cementing pre-existing negative, but more importantly, inaccurate stereotypes of what it looked like to be from Africa or India, which is displayed in the images that you'll see later. They often use the word, they refer to these countries as dominions, and that particularly makes me feel uncomfortable knowing how these countries were reduced down to a term that literally just means to be mastered, ruled, and possessed. I'm going to pass you back to Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. So this is hopefully the first of a series of roundtable events I'll be holding as part of this project. And the purpose of this roundtable is for people to share knowledge of the 1911 Festival of Empire and other insights and perspectives related to the site's past, its present and its future. So this roundtable is also for us to discuss as a group and with you, the audience, how this example of empire marketing history might continue to be made visible and critically examined through future projects such as this and through knowledge exchange. And the following questions will guide our discussion. What do we know about the 1911 Festival of Empire? What more is there to know? What significance does this history have for different people today? How would we like to see this history presented today? Where and by whom? So tonight we have 6 speakers who will offer snippets of knowledge and brief insights from very different angles, from the past, from the 1911 up to the present. And in order of appearance, we will have Richard Watkins, who's a tour guide and Crystal Palace Museum trustee, followed by Jane Collins, who's Professor of Theatre and Performance at Wimbledon College of Arts. Then Ollie Marshall, who's the creative lead at the Crystal Palace Bowl. Then Dr. Dan Burn-Smith, the Senior Lecturer in Fine Art Theory at Chelsea College of Art, followed by Dr. Nikki Ryan, Dean of Design at London College of Communication. And last but by no means least, Wendy Cummings, the Director of the Radiate Festival, which is held in Crystal Palace Park. So thank you all speakers for participating in this evening's event. And as Rahul said, we look forward to discussing any comments and questions that you have in the audience here presented for us this evening. But I'll now hand over to Richard, our first speaker.
Hello, well, thanks very much, Lucy. And I'm delighted to be invited to this roundtable event, and I hope this project will turn out some very interesting progressive research and from a very important and interesting angle. And as Lucy says, I'm a trustee, volunteer and tour guide at the Crystal Palace Museum, and a tour guide generally in my daily life as well. And a couple of years ago, I did some research to put together an illustrated talk on the Festival of Empire. And at the heart, it was a glorified shop window, really, for the dominions, which Lydia has already referred to, which were, in a sense, a sort of upper echelon right up in the food chain of kind of colonized countries. And they, to advertise to Londoners and other Brits to emigrate, to come to those countries to live and work and to help to settle perhaps Europeanized type cities and work and life. And those dominions specifically were Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Newfoundland, which was still a separate sovereign country from Canada at that time, South Africa and India. And it was all these sort of big roos and mainly pioneered by a chap called Robert George Windsor Clive, from quite a prestigious aristocratic lineage, and invested in by him and a number of his sort of aristocratic mates. And he was a Conservative Minister Commissioner of the Works at the time as well. And this was all going to be presented in the Crystal Palace Park, but not a thing that the Crystal Palace exhibition company was actually putting on, who were in receivership at the time, going bankrupt, separately sort of contracted out event. And it would be done by putting together 3/4 size replicas, and some of which you can see in the slide we're showing here, of parliamentary buildings from the capitals of each of those dominions, and a variety of other buildings from the countries, involving 300 different buildings in all. In addition to that was a presentation of a series of natural landscapes. So what they did was to large swathes of the park down below the terraces, sort of convert them, create them into working landscapes like a South African diamond mine, an Indian tea plantation, and so on. A hell of a lot of painted canvas went into this because it was done by a lot of theatricality and trickery. And then, as I think it's already been hinted, and we've seen a sort of map of the site, they designed a circular red route rail service. People could hop onto a train going for over a mile and go round, get off at various of these buildings. And inside the buildings, the people from the dominions, representatives, would put on show a series of objects and actually allow companies to kind of advertise, and travel companies to give offers to attract people to come to their countries. Into the mix of all of this was a presentation of, and germane to the kind of aims of this project, I suppose, of natives at work. So there was a group of African tribesmen invited over, Indians to sort of work on a tea plantation, to show Maoris constructing an indigenous village, if you like. Malays is shown in the process of putting together a traditional domestic house. I think in my research, I thought I was clear this was a genuine attempt to show authentic ways of building and working and so on, and with real people. They weren't stuffed dummies, although it was a sort of fabricated event, sort of backdrop. And as well, I think there's the great perspective to bear in mind that Londoners and people visiting would not have seen anything like, most of them, unless you were very posh and you could afford to travel, anything like these kind of crafts and skills and techniques being demonstrated, and probably not met people from these kind of countries at all. However, of course, it would seem very odd to us today, 100 years later, viewing this kind of thing. Would we sort of think of it as a bit like humans as animals in a zoo? And I think it would make us feel a little bit uncomfortable, and it's very true to say we wouldn't do it like that today. And there is a certain amount of patronizing language that we would find anyway in the programs and so on, that you find. So it's fair to say that in putting together the illustrated presentation, there were things I wasn't able to sort of dig more deeply about. For example, how the peoples visiting, how they were treated and put up, and how the views of the authorities. Some of them, I think, in the Indian, there was an Indian pavilion, were almost considered as contemporaries, and there was an Indian society that had been established at the time. So I think it might have varied, yeah. But there is more perhaps to look into on that. But I haven't been entirely keeping check of my time. I think that's about 5 minutes. I'll hand back to Lucy.
Thank you, Richard. Without further ado, I think I'll hand over to our next speaker. Jane, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. My presentation is called Staging the Empire, Scale and the Performance of Power. And I think it follows on quite well from some of the things that Richard's been saying. Could I have the first slide, please, Lucy? Thank you. The first thing you learn about writing for the stage is that the play takes place in the head of the audience. So for the next few minutes, I just want to ponder on the Festival of Empire from the perspective of its audience, to see it as a scenographic space that presents this audience with an apparently stable and detached point of view, allowing them to project themselves into the stage scenarios by just looking. However, just looking is a very complicated process. Next slide, please. What seems to be just there to be seen is in fact rerouted through memory and fantasy, caught up in threads of the unconscious and entangled with the passions. More than that, seeing appears to alter the thing seen and to transform the one seeing, showing them to be profoundly intertwined in the event that is visuality. So just looking is in fact a complex web of sensory interactions, and these interactions are themselves subject to different historic and cultural conditions. So what were the historical and cultural conditions of the audience in 1911? Briefly, the audience, of course, was not a homogenized mass. It would have been a sharply delineated along social and economic lines. Next slide, please, Lucy. London was a deeply divided city with abject poverty, cheek by jowl with incredible wealth, much of it gained from colonial investment. The festival opened against the backdrop of Irish nationalism, striking dock workers, and the women's suffrage movement. Next slide, please. In addition, confidence in the belief of the civilizing mission of empire was fading among certain sectors of the educated middle class. There was also a growing sense among politicians that the ties that bound the empire were loosening as independence movements continued in India and South Africa. It's worth noting that the African National Congress was founded in 1912, just 6 months later. So it's in this context that the British public were presented with a celebration of trade and industry geared towards reinforcing in their minds the greatness of Britain and by association themselves as British subjects. So what did they see? Next slide, please. Well, they saw the Parliament buildings of many colonies, but scaled down, as Richard says, as 3/4 size replicas. Impressive, but maybe not overpowering. It's quite likely that this was a pragmatic decision to do with cost, but scale has a performative function in architecture, and these buildings were diminished. Next slide, please. Thank you, Lucy. To paraphrase Levi Strauss, being smaller, the object as a whole seems less formidable. And this quantitative transposition extends and diversifies our power over it, so it can be grasped, assessed, and apprehended at a glance. Next slide, please. Likewise, the dioramas. Complex human interactions are simplified and laid out for the viewer to just look at from the comfort of the miniature railway. Next slide, please. These model worlds seem to be unpopulated, which is quite interesting that this diamond mine, where we know that the conditions were terrible in Kimberley and that thousands and thousands of Africans died in the process of mining there because there's no people in that one. Apart from, of course, the Indian tea plantation. Could we have a look at that, please? Thank you. Next slide, Lucy. Where a male mannequin is very prominent, wearing a lungi. However, this figure presents the onlooker with a spectacle within the spectacle, as clothes in the form of westernized dress were seen as symbols of progress. So clearly this gentleman model has not progressed enough in the Western mind. Okay, to conclude, so what am I trying to say here? The German academic Witt Ehrman posits the idea of the mutual construction of fake identities between colonizer and colonized as part and parcel of imperial practice. Now, I'm stretching his argument a bit here, but it seems to me that the fake identities of the empire, manufactured for the exhibition, colluded in the construction of fake identities for the audience. And these mutual constructs, the inflated sense of British imperial power, matched by the diminution of the colonies in terms of the scale models, feed into each other with potentially tragic consequences for both parties. How many of those young men across all social classes who visited the festival in 1911 as audience carried that inflated sense of Britannia with them into the trenches 3 years later? How many colonial citizens were also lost in those battles, believing they were part of a great British empire worth dying for? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you. Over to our next speaker, Ollie.
Hi everyone, thanks Lucy. So I'm going to speak just in this section about the Pageant of London. What was the Pageant of London? Well, essentially it was a huge theatrical and musical spectacular based around historical reenactments of significant chapters of British history, of the empire, and the history of the capital. Now, pageants were a format beloved of the Victorians and the Edwardians, and this one has been described as probably the biggest and most ambitious of the era. It was virtually Olympic in scale, and the Olympic Games is an interesting comparison. So at the opening ceremony of London 2012, there were 10,000 performers in the stadium. For the Pageant of London in 1911, there were 15,000 participants, so even bigger. There were 32 scenes in total, and if you wanted to see the whole thing, you'd have to go for 3 days in a row. So it stretched over 3 complete days. And for the 3 months that it ran, from June to September, they had over 1 million spectators came to watch the pageant. So it really was, in many respects, the centerpiece of the Festival of Empire. It covered all sorts of things within the act. So it started out with early history, the pagans and the druids. It covered Roman Britain, the Danish invasion, the Norman conquest, monarchies and the restoration. It did cover certain aspects of the empire and colonial history, but from what we gather, these were fairly one-sided perspectives, probably catering in some respects to the audience that were there. So they featured Captain Cook's voyages of discovery to Australia. They covered trade with the West Indies only in very general terms. You can just roll through the next couple of slides. You see. So there's just an image of the grandstand and the view that the spectators would have had of some of the performers. And next slide, please. And this is a view from the pageant ground to the grandstand. So just featuring a couple of particular individuals. They hired an architect called Sir Aston Webb, who was very much the establishment architect of the day to build this temporary grandstand. You can still see many of his buildings in London, kind of big triumphal classical structures like Admiralty Arch, the facade of Buckingham Palace, certain wings of the V&A. And they also hired, as the master of ceremonies, a chap called Frank Lascelles, who organised a lot of other things like the coronation, some of the durbars. So if pomp and ceremony was the aim, you were really hiring in these two kind of the imperial A team. It would be akin to kind of hiring, you know, Norman Foster and Andrew Lloyd Webber or Danny Boyle today to stage a similar spectacular. Next slide, please. So just looking at the site on the left, you can see on this slide an extract from the 1911 plan. And you can still see certain features that are visible in the park today. So we've got the Anglers Lake there at the top and the maze. But if you look down towards the bottom, you can see where it mentions site of the Pageant of London and that kind of concave amphitheatre. On the right is quite clearly the site today of the Crystal Palace Bowl. We flick over to the next slide, please, Lucy. So this is an image taken of the pageant ground in 1911 from the top of the water tower, the north water tower in the palace, which was, I think, 280 feet up. So something in the Victorians and the Edwardians knew a thing or two about was romantic landscapes, and clearly they had sensed the inherent drama in this natural amphitheatre. If you click to the next slide, please. And this is the very same view today, just taken a few weeks ago. There's no North Water Tower now, so that was taken from a drone hovering over the exact spot where the water tower would have been. But you can see very much the landscape is the same as you saw from 110 years ago. And the lake and the lawn and the amphitheatre where the audience would have been is much the same. Next slide, please. So 50 years after the Festival of Empire, in the 50s and early 60s, the site was actually inaugurated as a permanent proper concert bowl. For about a decade, there were a run and a sequence of very popular classical music and orchestral performances. Next slide, please. And then throughout the 70s and 80s, it became really well known for pop and rock music concerts. The likes of Elton John, Lou Reed, Pink Floyd and the Beach Boys all appeared there. Next slide, please. There was a very famous concert by Bob Marley, a record-breaking concert. And while some of the audiences in 1911 sat quite prim and proper in the grandstand, the audiences in those days were more likely to frolic around in the lake, rather refreshed, one would imagine. Next slide, please. So while the stage itself has changed several times over the years, what you see on the site today is probably the 4th or 5th stage, in fact. So it's moved from a kind of classical concert shell to what locals know as the beloved rusty laptop today. I think the important thing for us in terms of the physical legacy of 1911 is that you have a performance space which is still used today that stretches back for over 110 years. Next slide, please. So just to bring things briefly up to date, the group that I'm part of is a community-powered organisation that's been trying to revive this wonderful space and venue. We registered it recently as an asset of community value. Last year, we crowdfunded this lovely blue plaque with the Nubian Jack Community Trust to celebrate Bob's record-breaking concert. Next slide, please. And then finally, some of you may be aware that we've been crowdfunding this year to restore the stage and enable live music and performance to return, which you should be doing around August or September time with a new festival. So big thanks to anyone who's on the call and joining us tonight who did pledge and back the campaign along with the Mayor of London. And we look forward to seeing the space back in use very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ollie. And thanks to our first 3 speakers and Lydia for your contribution so far. Bringing us from 1911 up to present day through various decades of activity on the same site. Thank you if you're already posting to the Q&A chat. We'll be coming towards that after the next 3 speakers. We've got a good kind of half an hour for discussion and an audience Q&A after that. Just to also like to say at this point that if you'd like to get involved in this knowledge exchange project in some way, speak perhaps at a future roundtable. I know that in the audience this evening we have some other people that have real expertise on this topic. So if you'd like to get involved in future events or other activities, then please drop me a line. My email's there on the screen and I'll show that again at the end. So time now for our next 3 speakers, again kind of bringing us up to date really, so that then we can in the discussion go back to thinking about what does this historical mean event mean for us as kind of contemporary audiences, park goers, academics, cultural producers, etc. Dan, are you ready? Shall I hand over to you now?
Yes, sure, I think so. So yeah, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to this. I'm going to talk, I'm just going to time myself. I'm going to talk very, very kind of personally and yeah, from a certain point of view, let's say, about how I've been thinking about the site and the Festival of Empire as kind of one event within the history of the site. And it's something I mentioned in the kind of research that I started doing in the late 90s, and then it ended up feeding into my PhD and into this very short book in a very, very reduced version, where the festival only gets a few lines, but it was an amazing object to kind of find out about. And the museum on site was really kind of instructive in that way. And there's a little bit that I found about it. So what I'm going to talk about very briefly today is how I think the Festival of Empire is part of a bigger narrative about the site, about the Crystal Palace itself, about the park, and about the legacy of the Great Exhibition, and how it then relates to this question of what significance does this have today? Because I guess my argument is that if we look at the idea of the modern museum is to a very large extent, if we can generalize about what that is, formed by the Great Exhibition and its legacies, including the Crystal Palace. And while the Museum of South Kensington is a very important kind of continuation of those sort of expansions into what we understand of the modern museum, the actual construction of audiences and knowledge and ideology was far more prevalent, I think, and powerful in the Crystal Palace. So we tend to think of modern museums as coming from the bequests of personal collectors. And there's a lot of truth in that. The British Museum was founded from a bequest from Hans Sloane in his death in 1753, but it didn't become a public institution. The idea of something public in that way did not exist in 1753. I would argue that it only came into being really in 1851 with the Great Exhibition, and kind of developed through a whole tradition of international exhibitions around the world. And it was very much kind of extended and expanded in Sydenham, in Crystal Palace. So a lot of this kind of ties into something that the sociologist and historian Tony Bennett talks about, not the singer Tony Bennett, but the other Tony Bennett. And he has this idea of the exhibitionary complex. And it's a way that a kind of institutional framework of power and spectacle comes together in the 19th century. So I think this is this new site of social and cultural power, of institutional relationships. And it's a move from private to public. And it's a creation of a public. It's a creation of a public who come to see a spectacle and who become part of that spectacle, who come to be edified and educated, but also are kind of formed and controlled as a social body. And as Jane pointed out, this wasn't a homogenous public. It was a very socially, economically, culturally diverse, well, maybe not culturally, but diverse public. So when I first started coming to visit the park, my impression was very much that it was a ruin, that it was something where the structure had kind of been demolished to reveal something else. And I became interested in these, what appeared to be geological forms that had been left over by some kind of vast event that had taken place before my lifetime. And it was only through kind of historical uncovering and through spaces like the museum that I even discovered the role of the Festival of Empire within this. But essentially what happened at the Crystal Palace after the Great Exhibition was a huge simulation of an idea of Western civilization that placed kind of Victorian modernity at the top. The entire project was fake, was a simulacra that constructed this kind of ideological form and constructed an idea of time. And the park becomes like a fossil. So it becomes a fossil that confuses nature and the social in a way, in the way that the writer Walter Benjamin wrote about it. And in a way, the Festival of Empire is a kind of last gasp of this form to survive as a site. It was already kind of on the way out. So long before the fire, the site was in trouble, and this was one last enormous thing. But it didn't end. And I think instead it kind of resonated through the idea of the museum as a civilizing universal force. So in short, my argument is we're still living with the Festival of Empire. So this task of decolonizing, of critically unpacking these histories and institutions is very much the kind of task of the present that relates to kind of where museums come from. And the Festival of Empire is a kind of, you know, secret narrative within that story that really does need to be kind of exposed and unpacked more in order to engage more fully in that process. Okay, I've reached 5 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dan. That's really enriching. Nikki, are you ready?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Hi, I've been asked to say a few words about the research I conducted on the Crystal Palace Park and community, and that was done a few years ago. And it's resulted in a number of conference papers, a publication, and a few chapters of a PhD. I was originally going to do my PhD around the Sydenham Crystal Palace. My interest in Crystal Palace stems from my background as an art and design historian, interested in space, place, architectural and urban theory, but also as a local resident and frequent visitor to Crystal Palace. What struck me about the park was a continuing council commitment to regeneration, but a singular failure to come up with any proposals which were acceptable to the local community. Of course, there is no such thing as a homogenous community, and as I discovered through my interviews, that communities are often riven by tensions, conflict, and difference. I wanted to discover why this site was so contentious and understand more broadly the role of community in the development of urban regeneration schemes. Place identity, as Doreen Massey has argued, is temporary, uncertain, and always in process. It is something which is continually negotiated and contested. Debates about what should replace the Crystal Palace have been ongoing since its destruction in 1936, with competing claims surfacing as community groups argued in defence of a particular vision that expressed their own material, social, and imaginative attachment to the site. Now, the next slide, please, Lucy. In the late 1990s, many of the various community groups came together to collectively contest proposals for a flagship development designed by high-profile modernist architect Ian Ritchie. This unusual coalition of interests is what I used as my case study to kind of weigh into this particular area. Objections to the multi-million-pound mixed-use leisure centre coalesced around the style and scale of the proposed structure, the loss of parkland through privatisation of public space, an increase in traffic noise and pollution, and importantly, a lack of consultation throughout the development process. Next slide, please. The protest groups united behind the most powerful and vocal of the local organisations, the Crystal Palace campaign, under the leadership of Philip Colvin, a local barrister and elected chair, who I interviewed, among many other community groups, to challenge the proposed development in the courts. The legal battle failed, but it generated significant publicity, and this, in combination with local activism, marches and petitions, contributed to Bromley Council withdrawing its plans in 2001. Part of the legacy of these activities was a safe park, but also the introduction of a process of dialogue to overcome the challenge of local groups to agree among themselves a sustainable future for the park. Have the next slide, please. The independently facilitated Crystal Palace dialogue process began in 2003, cost £5 million, and was the forum for discussion among over 200 stakeholders. The process was created with the aim of exploring differences and common ground between local community groups, so that they would arrive at a consensual solution for the development of the site. As part of the process, in 2007, a new vision for Crystal Palace Park by German architects Latz and Partner was introduced for discussion. And this is the scheme that I'm surprised is still on the table, although not completed due to lack of finances and ongoing objections to the building of private houses in the park to partially fund this work. As someone who believes in the value of co-designing with stakeholders, I think that's really important. I was really interested in why the participants I interviewed were quite critical of the dialogue process. The concerns they expressed to me were about the extent to which the membership was actually really representative of local community interests, that meetings were dominated by a small number of vocal participants, a suspicion that the master planners were using the dialogue process as a form of tokenism to justify preconceived plans, and that the enforced code of conduct was a system of closure for the control of consent and the manufacturing of singular politics. One of the criticisms levelled at communicative action or deliberate democracy, where action is based on consensus achieved through the power of reasoned argument, is that it can benefit existing elites. Consensus excludes difference and masks power, whereas power needs to be recognised rather than removed. Regeneration and placemaking strategies can result in the flattening of individual historical and contextual differences and the erasure of lived experience. I think, although maybe people who are in the audience might have been part of this, might have very different views, but I think we still need to work much harder to overcome social and racial exclusion in these processes and to ensure that people are empowered to challenge the dominant narratives of place. The work of Lucy and many people here today is an important step in reinstating those lost and missing voices as we continue to renegotiate the identity of Crystal Palace Park. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki, so much. And now to hand over to our final speaker. Wendy, are you ready?
I am indeed. Good evening, good evening. So I'm Wendy Cummings, I'm the director of Radiate Festival. Radiate Festival is the creator of the Windrush Festival for London, which we chose to hold at London's iconic Crystal Palace Park. I started this process late 2016, early 2017, when I decided that I needed something that would speak to me, my experience, my culture, my history, and that could form a part of the legacy of my people, in short. And so I set about kind of looking for a date in British history specifically that would help me to, cement my identity here in Britain. So you can go to the first slide, Lucy. Thank you. So by now we're all very, very, very familiar with this ship called the Empire Windrush. So the Empire Windrush, as we all will know, docked 1948 in Tilbury Docks, and there were Caribbean or West Indian, as they were called at the time, passengers who disembarked and decided to call the UK or Britain home. And, they were called to come after the Second World War, specifically, after having actually taken part in the First and Second World Wars. They were called to come and rebuild Mother England. And, it's a phrase that was often on their tongues, and that's how they used to see Britain. That's how they were educated to see Britain, through colonialism and enslavement. And I actually loved when Jane said about kind of fake Britannia, and this identity or this ideology of Great Britain being this homogenized idea of kind of culture and opulence, and this whole propaganda narrative that was being pushed on, I suppose, British people, as well as people from the West Indies and from what we now have called in this conversation the Dominions, that Britain was this great place that everybody needed to be connected to in some kind of way. So when I kind of looked in the diary, I looked at the dates and I saw, the Windrush is the date that I wanted to choose, because it is the date that cemented really our mass migration presence here in the UK and underpins this idea that we now know as multiculturalism. And with our arrival, we brought much colour, we brought much music, we brought much celebration. You'll know that famous song of London is the Place for Me by Lord Kitchener. That's what he was singing coming off of the boat. And when when my grandparents and great grandparents came, they thought that the roads were paved with gold. And by thinking that the roads were paved with gold, that's what they were sold. That's what they were advertised. And it shows just how great the British were at propaganda and bringing people into the vision. So the empire of the festival doesn't really surprise me when Lucy kind of brought it over and said, hey, what do you think of this? I was like, it makes sense. I get it. So when I grew up in Sydenham. So Crystal Palace Park isn't new to me. it's my stomping ground. It's where I grew up. It's where I played. It's where, you know, being in Sydenham, I could open my window and hear the racing cars racing around Crystal Palace. I could hear when Capital FM were there. I could hear the concerts of the 80s and 90s. And, you know, I was in Sydenham, and that's how far I could hear the activity and the life that was Crystal Palace Park. So when I decided that I wanted to create an outdoor festival, Crystal Palace was a no-brainer for me because I had such fond memories of it. But what I also knew was that there was very little representation for the Black community, the Caribbean community in our outdoor spaces beyond something like Carnival, where you can show, where you see an element of our presence. You know, beyond that, we didn't really have something that was an annual outdoor festival that we could celebrate us and who we are. So when I started going about this, I was, you know, telling people about the Windrush. Some of them knew, but not a lot of them did know. And then the Windrush scandal happened and everybody knew. And it was like, okay, great. We're going to hold this thing in this park because what I want to do is show our culture from our lens and our perspective in a way where it's not done from the white colonial lens, which is always what happens with Black culture. It's homogenized, it's picked out into pieces. You've got your jerk chicken, you know, you've got your gospel choirs, you've got your steel pans, and you know, and you've got a bit of reggae music, and that's you, that's who you are. And for me, I was like, no, there are so many nuances across our Caribbean and West Indian culture that need to be shown, that need to have space to be expressed, and I need that space to do that. So I created a grassroots organization led by an army of one and the power of my community, and I set about finding this space. So we've been here since 2018. We've, as you can see, the slide says family and generations. That just speaks volumes. We get 5 generations of one family coming to our event because the Windrush and the identity is so important to our communities that they bring everybody out, literally, to say, this is our thing. So, you know, that's why every year I fight tooth and nail to make sure it continues to exist, even with the regeneration that is happening with Crystal Palace Park. You know, so if you can go to the next slide, Lucy, I'll speed through these just to kind of, just to show you a visualization. This is a mural that we created in for the 70th anniversary, and it's 20 foot by 10 foot. And you can see, you know, there's references to the Empire Windrush in there. You can see the various different flags from what they were deemed as colonies. And this was a representation by Quincy Logie, where we wanted to create something that was bang in your face, that said, we are here, we've been here, we're not going anywhere else, we've put down roots and we're here to stay. And that picture, for me, kind of brought all of that identity together in terms of the displacement that I was feeling, not feeling British enough, not feeling Caribbean or West Indian enough. You know, that kind of spoke so much to me, and so much, it evoked so much emotion to everybody who kind of saw this life, this massive billboard size imagery, which they could identify and point to their flags. Next slide, Lucy. So here you can see the touch of colonialism, which was mentioned earlier, in terms of the Madras dress. So the Madras dress obviously comes from linking India with the Caribbean to the UK. So this is essentially what the 1911 festival was doing, trying to show these elements of, you know, how Britain had brought this, you know, these worlds together, these colorful worlds. And you can still see it today when we have Creole performers who are dancing in Madras dress. And that's specifically from St. Lucia, if anyone wants to go and look it up. Next slide, Lucy. Family and generations, obviously we've seen this, all of the 5 generations who come from one family. Next slide, Lucy. Okay, so platforms and art forms, as you see on the left hand side, you've got your sound systems, which are our big box speaker systems, and then you've got general dance groups, you know, and this is the kind of thing that we bring into the festival to show, you know, the multiplicity of our culture and the fact that there is color, there is life, there is noise. And we can't live in a homogenized, silent world because we want serene parks that, you know, is great for just a, you know, an afternoon stroll, but nothing else happens. We want life, we want color, we want culture. Next slide, Lucy. And this says it all, taking up space. So when you look at this imagery, the imagery on the left is something that we've been cultured to be scared of in our spaces, in our public realms, as though when you see this image on the left, this is something that you need to err on the side of caution. But these are young people at our event, having a nice time, taking up space and not apologizing for it. We need to see more of this. We need to not be selective in terms of who can enter these spaces and actually liberally just be without question. You know, and then you see on the right-hand side, you see young people, men as well, playing football, because this is also what we do. You know, we're not just one way. We are dynamic in the individuals that we are, and we want the opportunity to show that everywhere we go. Next slide, Lucy. Do I have a next slide? Oh, I do have a next slide. So the pioneers and the elders, these are the people that came before us. These are the people that decided to make this decision to come to the UK, save all of their pennies. And on the right, you'll see that is a nurse who worked in the NHS, which was formed based on the migration of Caribbean, African, Indian labour to the UK. And we want to make sure that we're celebrating that every single year, that we're providing spaces that our elders can come and feel valued, because that is something that they have not felt in the time that they've been here, in the last 70 plus years. Next slide, Lucy. Thank you. I've nearly done. And cars and culture. So what these images show is the Black man and his car. It's a thing. It's always been a thing. And every year we have the classic car show, the Afro Classic Car Show at our event, because the cars and culture aspect of who we are was our way of saying, oh, we've made it. You know, we came to England from foreign, and we've actually done something with ourselves. And so there's a whole deep history around, you know, the Black community and their cars that showed wealth in the ways that we could. So all of these images that I've showed you today is just to show you us in ways that you don't normally get to see us, because we don't normally get to have these spaces. So thank you for listening to me today. And I'm Wendy from Radiate Festival.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And I can't wait for the festival. It's only a few weeks away now, it feels like.
It is.
That's all of our speakers, and I'm just so glad that everybody could make it here this evening. And Wendy, you know, when we first spoke, we had a fantastic discussion about the kind of the layers of the park, and those terraces being so much more than just a surface of grass. You know, when I first went to the Radiate Festival, not the last one, but the one before that, I sat there, and it was just at the same time that I discovered, you know, I felt like I'd discovered for the first time the 1911 festival, and bought that postcard and stuck it up on my kitchen wall. And I was sitting there thinking, this is amazing. I'm at this festival organised by yourself, with such rich content that's telling me the story of the Windrush generation in all its diverse forms, using all different artistic media. And yet 110 years ago, on this exact bit of grass, there was kind of an exhibition and a display of culture, organised by who, for what purposes, for a very different purpose, and by a very different group of people. And I just thought that those layers, how do we represent those layers now? How do we peel them back? You know, and this is where I'm really interested in kind of visualization and virtual reality or augmented reality. How can we show multiple stories and perspectives in a kind of dynamic format? So yeah, thank you so much, Wendy. I don't know if you wanted to sort of say anything about that immediately before we open up to comments.
No, I think one thing I would just say is, how do we do that? We do that by empowering and enabling the groups to represent their own narratives, and you fund them, you support them, and you promote them to be able to have the space to use their own voices, to use their own culture, to actually present who they are to you, so that you can enjoy and learn. And that's the difference, I think.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And I'm really hoping that with knowledge exchange, for me, as a kind of arm of the university, it's an arm that can support, hopefully, that empowerment. by sharing resource that the university has. We have technical resources, we have the kind of academic knowledge, but to support groups in the community to develop and generate those kind of various cultural responses. So it's time now to open up the discussion. Firstly, amongst the panelists here, we've all heard each other but haven't had a chance. This is the first time that we've met in this space. The 6 of us, or the seven or eight of us that are here around this table. So this is the time for us to discuss and share any responses that we have to the different presentations that we've heard this evening, and to also to respond to the key questions that have been posted to the chat. And thank you, Rahul, you've been kind of alerting me to some of the questions that have come in, and they're really interesting, and some of them are directed to some of us in particular. So first, I suppose, panelists, is there anything you wanted to kind of respond or share in to what we've heard this evening from other speakers?
It's just very interesting to hear everyone's different points of view, how they see it as an engagement project, which is what I was quite interested in, is how it's quite an interesting place to engage in, because it's like a blank canvas, but with all these ideas going on in the background. There they go. Yeah, no, very good. Yeah.
Thank you, David. And thank you, David, and I'm really glad that you could make it this evening, because whilst you wasn't an official member of the Roundtable tonight, you've played such a valuable role in here in trying to help us to start revisualizing, you know, what happened, and to hopefully enable at some point we could have some kind of like virtual walkthrough simulation of the festival. It's finding the resource to do that, and then, you know, then the time, but, you know, essentially what the 1911 festival was doing, which Richard, Jane and Ollie, what you've kind of started to reveal to us through your presentations, is what the organisers in 1911 were trying to do, was simulate. If they had virtual reality, they would have used virtual reality to transport people to the so-called dominions in the way that they wanted it to be seen, you know. So I think that's why I'm quite excited about us using the creative technology that we have now to re-simulate the simulation of the 1911 festival in a way, and to kind of add to that our multiple interpretations of that, because we're all going to look back at that event in slightly different ways according to how our people might be represented there. I'm of Indian descent, and, you know, I think for me, when I saw the image of the man in the longi in the Indian tea plantation, my jaw dropped because I thought, really, in 1911 they were still depicting my people like that? But then I thought, well, of course they would depict people because they were workers on a plantation, and they wanted them to be seen as workers, not kind of in any other capacity. So I think there's so many things to be sort of discussed and explored here around sort of representation. So just to ask again, panelists, anything that anyone else wanted to say before we turn over to questions?
I just wanted to kind of ask, for those that are on the call that are working in terms of the regeneration plan and, you know, bringing Crystal Palace back to its former glories, you know, what are their thoughts on the best ways to be able to bring Crystal Palace back in a way that doesn't reinforce this idea of African slave labor and you know, tea makers from India? You know, how are they working to make sure that actually we reframe history in terms of we keep its context, but we bring it into today? Do you know what I mean? In terms of, you know, the expression of culture and the sharing of racial difference, you know, what is informing their work from a racial perspective? That was a really long question. I'm sorry. You can pick it apart and answer whatever it is that you feel.
I think it might be an invitation. I don't know if Ollie or Richard from the museum would like to comment.
Good question, Wendy. I mean, I think the thing that always strikes you with Crystal Palace, you know, the more you dig and the more you get to know about it, is just how much has happened here. You know, you mentioned about hearing, you know, the kind of motor racing or pop music and this sport. And I mean, you know, this is just going back, you know, 30, 40, 50 years. It's before you go back 110 years to the festival. So I think it's a huge challenge curatorially for anyone to break down and unpack, you know, 150 years of history and highlight and hone in on, well, what are the significant chapters? You know, what are the bits that people really need to leave the site or to kind of have at the forefront of their mind? And the good thing about the discussion tonight, I think, is that 1911 is clearly an overlooked chapter. I mean, the fact that there's so little physical remnants or history of it there is one thing, but you know, you could thumb through a history book of Crystal Palace and it wouldn't get that much of a mention, at least in the things that I've seen. When we've done guided tours around the concert bowl site, certainly very few people seem to know much about it. You know, they know more recent history, they know about the palace burning down, they know about, you know, the Victorian engineering, but very little about this kind of 1 year where it was really a, you know, imperial propaganda. So yeah, in answer to your question, I just think it's something which we need to put more of an emphasis on, and perhaps some of those images that were shared, the kind of postcards and slides of the time, while, you know, the scale of it and the constructions that filled the grounds of the palace were quite impressive. The ones that showed a tea plantation or that showed a South African diamond mine were also kind of quite shocking in a way, be it for the absence of people or, you know, the way that they were portrayed. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, Lucy, if you asked me as well, and so perhaps on a sort of factual level, I think that Wendy was asking about the future plans for the park. There, an actual cooperative community organisation was established some years ago, which we're tangentially we're kept in contact with at the museum, who are now sort of officially been delegated the task of bringing forward plans, and I think, sort of as Nikki hinted, you know, they are kind of based on, they're picking the skeleton or the backbone out of the last big player on the scene, which was the one which really fell in 2008, and they're trying to develop that up with hardly any money, and I can't remember the name of their actual organization, and I don't know the details of what they're doing in terms of involving diversity of cultures and so on, but there is work, but from a very low base, that's kind of restarting. I would just say, I think, just to add to what Nikki excellently sort of talked about the process of the consultation and so on that led up to that plan. I think basically it fell because of the credit crunch and Bromley Council saying, right, we can't afford to spend on such luxury projects now, we're going to withdraw our funding. And so then it couldn't go ahead and they never put it up again. And then we had the complication of this Chinese thing coming and going, which always seemed a little bit mad, this sort of this Zongrong group offering £500 million as part of a thing to recreate the Crystal Palace. Anyway, that ended up dead in the water as well. But yeah, and there are some of the questions coming in when you get to those, Lucy. I'm happy to chip in on.
Thank you, Richard. And I think, yeah, that's timely, because I think we can move to those now, and they allude to some aspects of what you've both just been speaking about there. So thank you, Ollie and Richard, for responding to Wendy's question there. Really important question. So Rahul, could you take us through some of the questions from the audience, please?
Yeah, I'll take this one from Susan, and which people can take up. And then there are a number of them around the theme of the word imperial, the use of the word imperial legacies. So I'll try and summarize those. Yeah, so from Susan Finding, this is a question about migration outwards and inwards. The festival of 1911 appears to have contributed to a culture of promotion of the dominions of the empire, of Great Britain and of London. Does anyone know if there is evidence that this was a definite strategy by the organizers, or was it worked, i.e. people emigrated as a result, or did it work, I should say. Tasmin says, how do you feel about the word imperial if you see it in your organization's name? How do you feel about it? And I think she references Imperial College as one. Some of the other organizations have changed their name. Alan Holton says at the beginning, there appeared to be mention of recreating the festival. Is that the purpose of this roundtable, or is it about the future of the park in general? From Gurnham, the historic exhibition, as presentations noted, were very much rooted in the Imperial project. Indeed, much of our architectural heritage and monuments are born out of the desire to construct and represent dominance. The question, what do we do with this historic legacy, and how do we decolonize curation to avoid repeating the same legacies? I'll take some more on later, but let's start with that with the panel. With the panel.
Rahul, I don't mind kicking off to go back to the initial one on the, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do, and the others will step in straight away. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. On the basic principles and intention of the festival, yes, that was the intention. As I kind of set out in my little bit, a sort of glorified shop window. It was a big advert for those countries known as dominions to attract people to emigrate from Britain to come and live and work and settle in those countries. Did it succeed? Perhaps it's difficult to tell, because in kind of analysis or assessment jargon, you might say, how can you separate it from the noise of all the other things that were going on to attract people? And there had been a general upward curve of emigration. And I mean, it was used as a tool of government sometimes, where if over populated workhouses, for example, they might give the opportunity for people to emigrate. And I mean, these places started off as penal colonies to forcibly emigrate people to. But certainly I've seen some figures about levels of emigration were already rising. For example, in 1909, over 1.5 million from Britain to these countries. By the 1920s, about 180,000 people were migrating to these countries from Britain. So yeah, in terms of how do I feel about imperial, well, perhaps I'll leave that to organizations who are part of people who are part of those organizations. So yeah, I'll let other people come in now.
Thank you. Does anyone want to come in? Jane, Nikki, Dan, Ollie, Wendy, Lydia, on those questions?
I was just going to come in. I mean, I think that later on there's another question about monuments. I mean, there's so much of our current society which is kind of imbued with this 19th century Victorian sensibility, I think, including so many of the organizations that we just take for granted. And I suppose it's the same with the monuments and the statues and the how do you unpack those histories? Is it about putting down statues, or I think what Gurnham's talking about is how do you curate in such a way that incorporates the complexities of those histories, or do you because it seems to me removing them is not necessarily an answer. It can't be removed, it's there, and it's as much a part of a history that I carry as a white British citizen, as it is for all the people that are involved from different perspectives. So I suppose it is. I think what Lucy's doing with this project is a fantastic starting point of saying, okay, we have these honest conversations and we try and unpack what was going on, and indeed, let's face it, what is still going on in terms of the promotion of a kind of Britishness, which I don't subscribe to, and I'm sure nobody around this table does, but it's done in our name, you know, and it's being perpetuated now. So I think the more that this is kind of picked apart and discussed, and as you say, going right back to the 19th century and looking at this the way knowledge is constructed in certain ways, the way we're made to see things from certain perspectives, this all has got to be unpacked, and it's just beginning now, I think, but it's still not happening in schools. It's still not happening, you know, right across the board.
Yeah, thank you. But does anyone else want to take it up from the panel?
I'll say a few words. I'll try not to get too, because yeah, obviously there's an awful lot to talk about in all this. Couple of things. For me, finding out about the Festival of Empire was a shock. It was a shocking moment to think that this thing existed, but it was also a shock because it pointed out a lack of knowledge, both in myself, but also, you know, more broadly and culturally, about the teaching of history. And I was shocked how shocked I was, and I shouldn't have been so shocked if that history had been taught properly, because it would have made perfect sense that this was the kind of narrative that was being presented. But on the question of like institutions that are called imperial, and obviously this ties into the ongoing and quite varied processes of decolonization. I don't think they're always imagined to be the same thing, and for some people, it may be about tearing down those monuments, memorials, and you know, I can kind of see why there's an impulse to do that. But on the other hand, obviously, there's a terrible backlash against that. I don't think it's any accident that Imperial College is situated right bang in the middle of Albertopolis, which is built, you know, which is one of those zones that's like very directly and quickly transformed by the Great Exhibition. It wasn't originally called Imperial College, it was called the Normal School of Science. And I guess personally, I'd like to see it return to that and be renamed. But yeah, it is part of that kind of network. And we see these traces all across Albertopolis. But yeah, they are interesting material traces to be unpacked. And part of the research I started doing around the Crystal Palace then led me to the Albert Memorial. And I found the original guidebook written to explain the Albert Memorial, which was still being used into the late 90s, early 20th century as an art historical account of what it meant, of what the various statuary on the Albert Memorial meant. And no one had questioned the idea of a woman exposing herself and her nakedness as the gift from the Indian subcontinent to the empire. No one had questioned that in the art historical writing, like in the late 20th century. And it's extraordinary how that narrative had just kind of come straight from the mid-19th century into the late 20th century and been unchallenged. I don't think we're in that place anymore, obviously. And the work of people like Dan Hicks and Alice Proctor is incredibly important. But I recently heard the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum say, you can't decolonize the V&A, it's a colonial museum.
Okay, thank you for that, Dan. If I can also I'll take in a couple of the other panels, and I'll put this question into the mix as well from Louisa. Are exhibitions museums inherently imperialists? And Louisa, they're saying it's in relation to the construction of Western knowledge. So into the mix as well. So does anyone else want to take up the rest of the kind of the questions, and Louisa's as well, if that's okay. Calling Lydia, Nikki, Ollie, anyone else, Wendy and or Lucy?
I think many exhibitions and museums are inherently imperialistic, but I agree with the other panelists about, I think that the best way is not to remove things, but to actually contextualize them. I think the Horniman Museum, which is not so far away, is a great example of having done that really well, removing their dioramas and getting the appropriate kind of local input into the new displays. And I think that sense of involving local communities and getting responses like Lucy is doing now to the site of Crystal Palace is really important. But I think, yeah, the way that, obviously artifacts are collected is by its very nature imperialistic. And it's, again, whether we return things, that's a huge question as well. But I do think it's important to contextualize things. And I don't think we always want to remove things, but to retell the stories so that people can learn from this. And, that I think that's the important lesson for the future.
Okay, and anyone else as well? And just to add into the mix, Nikki and other people as well, because there, in Bristol, the local community did want the statue to be moved into a museum, and they flatly refused to listen. They just said, we're not going to. So, we are into that kind of realm as well. And obviously people took action by themselves as well.
Yeah, Bristol's my hometown, strangely, and so I know it very well. And there is an exhibition of slavery in the Bristol Museum, so I'm amazed that they wouldn't take it in. And having to walk past Colston many times as a school kid, I'm kind of very glad he ended up in the Avon where he belongs. But I think, anyway, it's good that he's been taken out again, and that we can really think about the stories, because coming from Bristol, Colston was presented as philanthropist. There was no other narrative. And as a kid growing up during that time, there was nothing to kind of dispel that myth that basically all the good things about Bristol largely came from his munificence. And I think that it's important that you get that statue somewhere we can tell about exactly what the real situation was and where all that finance was derived from.
Okay, thank you for that. Would anyone else from the panel would like to add?
Can I just add to what Lydia's saying? And I think there's an urgency about this now, because there is a new narrative being written, which is trying to recast the empire as somehow a good thing. And I think these things, it's very important that all these narratives, all these statues are questioned and unpicked, and it's not you can't undo the past, but you can open up the past to a kind of scrutiny, and we should be mindful that this does seem to be a moment where I think if we don't, we're going to, the dominant narrative is going to be one which recasts that the us as an imperial power that goes on, that carries on,
And I think David Olaguso phrased it really well. This is bringing into history people who've been kept out of history. Yeah, and so the process of decolonization is bringing into frameworks those people who've continually been left out. So I think that's worth contextualizing as well. So Lucy, you wanted to come back.
Thank you. And exactly what you just said there takes me back to that original definition I offered about from the Museum of British Colonialism, which is set up by African women, to be said, and I don't believe it exists in a physical form. It's a kind of like a virtual idea of what does it mean to make a museum of British Empire and looking back at what happened and what it means. And that's exactly that. It's like whose voices were excluded, were oppressed, really tackling the misrepresentation, as Lydia pointed out in your presentation earlier about the Wikipedia page, about the negative and inaccurate stereotypes that they're lasting. They are really lasting to today, to people of my heritage, to other heritages, of that kind of casting of types. Just I think thank you for already mentioning fellow speaker about the Horniman Museum, I'm aware of the kind of community work that they're doing of rethinking about Kenyan communities in particular, and the relationship that those communities may have to objects in a collection. And then just to point out, you know, with Dan Hicks's work with the British Museum, or his book Brutish Museum, there's also like Manchester Museum were part of repatriating objects back to communities in Aboriginal and Torres Straits in consultation with those groups. So, and then there's also the Glasgow's Hunterian Museum have got a kind of new curator of discomfort.
Oh, right.
So there's these kind of examples of museums in different parts of the country, and I know in Germany as well, and other parts of like former imperial or colonizing countries, who are reframing what it means to curate. And I'm not a curator by trade, I'm not a historian, I'm coming to this as an artist and a teacher really, and an educator, and thinking kind of creatively, if we remove or want to remove objects that are sources of real trauma for people, or could give back something of meaning to others, you know, sacred ceremonial objects that for other might be a spoon in a glass box for us, but for another group of people it's a kind of lost artifact that bears so much spiritual significance. Then what's there in the place? And other panelists have said it's context, contextualization, and we're really great at doing that. We're great at having a discussion, we're great at offering multiple narratives. And coming back to my original point about creative media, and someone asked in the chat, is this event about restaging the festival? It's not about re-putting the festival back on, but it's about reimagining or re-visualizing through our digital media what that festival was, so that we can really understand what it was trying to do then and have a conversation about it now. And I think we've got the kind of media that museums today, we can use those facilities. I think at the Manchester Museum, because they're now going to have spaces where those objects once occupied, they're going to be gone. They're kind of seeing, well, what is the role of the museum? And they're seeing themselves as a generator of empathy or something like that, as May Ward, the chief curator there, said, that we're not about kind of necessarily holder of objects, but holder of stories and a protector of Indigenous stories as well, not just the kind of the same story that the Colonial Museum, you know, was formed on.
Yeah, Lucy, if Rahul, if it's okay, I wouldn't mind coming in with a couple of brief points. Okay. First of all, and perhaps to play a little bit of a devil's advocate with my panelist colleagues, to make a little bit of a point of saying, I think we ought to step back and make sure we're absolutely sure of the evidence. I mean, I would have liked to do a lot more research about the indigenous, for want of a better word, people, or coming over from the countries that were invited for the Festival of Empire, how they were treated, how they were consulted, how their work was presented. Was it authentic, the creation of Malay domestic houses? My impression is they were doing their thing, with as far as possible with the materials that they normally used. And so I'd be really interested to investigate more into that. And we shouldn't assume from either perspective that it was a doing to and telling them what to do, telling them to do something highly stereotypical that they didn't do, as well as you know. Anyway, I think that's important. But slightly out with perhaps my role in the Crystal Palace Museum. But I think in terms of imperializing museums, and it's fantastic the examples you just listed, Lucy. Yeah, I think we ought to have a context of the sort of understanding versus misunderstanding, which British museums and archaeology and the whole historical mission, if you like, since the Victorian period, or since antiquarians, going back to the Restoration, whatever you like, because wow, look at the British Museum, the V&A, what, not just for Londoners, South Kensington's, the Albertopolis, is one of my favourite places in London. But the way it's disseminated, great breakthroughs in learning about cultures and whatever it might be. That, I mean, the British Museum, on whatever Mesopotamian culture, or the one on Byzantium, that go deep, and I feel present a rich understanding. And if we were going, I would like to hope that we're developing a more nuanced view of empire rather than a more pro view of empire.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to have to stop you there. We have reached 6:30, so I'm going to hand back to Rahul. Were there any other speakers that wanted to have one final word, very briefly?
Could I just say something very briefly, Lucy? Just in answer to some of those questions, and I noticed Susan's also posted in the chat, I think we have to be very careful. These were transactions, these were monetary transactions. These people were bought over and paid. And I think that this idea that there was some sort of authenticity in what they were doing, this was a construction, this was a staged reconstruction of how they were being, if you like, they were acting their lives, they were presenting their lives in the form of a performance, and they were paid. And I think that the idea that what you see was somehow authentic is not possible, not in that transactional way. It was a performance, and that's the point that Ehrman makes about this part and parcel of imperial practice, is this mutual kind of construction of different identities. Sorry, I'll stop on that.
Thank you. For that, I'll just finish off. We've reached time, so apologies to the other panel. I just want to bring in the final point, and I don't think we need to discuss it now. It can be for another time, which is about compensation, which Gurnham mentions in his question, compensation and reparations. And the 1st of August 2020 in Brixton was the largest reparations demonstration that I've seen ever since those demonstrations started, those yearly demonstrations for reparations. So that's the final point, and I'm looking at time. So finally to you, Lucy, to wind up. Yeah, and thank you all the panelists.
Thank you so much, all of the panelists here this evening. Thank you so much, the audience, for the questions you've been providing, and that point finally read by Rahul there. I can point back to that Museum of British Colonialism website. They also have a really good definition of repatriation and reparation. Whole pages there to kind of help you understand what is meant by those terms, what is meant by those kind of what's intended by those actions. So I'd urge you to have a look. There's loads more, obviously, that needs to be discussed about this. This is why I said this is the first, hopefully, of a series of roundtables. We've only just scratched the surface this evening. We've unpacked, actually, a bit of a can of worms. They're slippery, they're sensitive, and I didn't put a trigger warning at the start of this, but this is really, really sensitive stuff that has real kind of emotional significance for many people. So I hope that you will join us in kind of future events. I'll put here again my email address. I haven't got a kind of a web page or an Instagram account or anything yet, because this really is the start of something that will be ongoing and iterative, and that I don't want to own as knowledge exchange. I'm just here to kind of provide a little bit of leadership and guidance and some resource, but this is about people sharing knowledge, developing that knowledge, so that we can kind of get a better understanding of these complex, sensitive and hidden colonial histories for future benefit. So thanks again, everybody, for joining me. This will be recorded and put onto YouTube. So future YouTube watchers also be advised that this will hopefully kind of continue to keep going on and take on a life of its own. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.